Everyone, and I'm sorry for the people who aren't here tonight because they're going to miss a cracking session, as our two guests are extremely articulate, extremely entertaining, and extremely knowledgeable. So I have with me Vladimir Arsenijević, who anyone who knows about the Balkans and Serbia will know who Vlado is because he's a highly respected novelist and translator and editor, and he runs a wonderful literary festival called Crocodile, to which he's invited me twice in the past 2 years, but unfortunately every time it coincides with the annual board meeting of the IWM. So I can't go, but we're changing the date so I can go next time. And
can't beat them, join them.
Exactly. So Vlado has written extensively in a literary fashion about what happened in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and is regarded as one of the most important cultural figures in Serbia. So we're very, very pleased that we've able to persuade him to come to Vienna for the month. Equally, we are pleased that Ilir Deda, who is known for his work primarily, I would say, in think tanks, but he's also been in politics in Pristina, in Kosovo. He was executive director of KIPRED, the Kosovo Institute for what is it? It's Politics Research and Development.
Policy research.
Policy research and development, exactly. So he was in, but he was. You were a member of parliament. Mm-hmm. Member of parliament. And but then he left politics, perhaps with a little touch of disillusionment. I don't know. He may be able to tell us later on.
A little touch would be an understatement.
And he now works for the Regional Cooperation Council in Sarajevo, which, for those who don't know, is a body which has had a surprising amount of quiet success over the years in trying to harmonize and bring together on political and economic and social levels the countries of the former Yugoslavia, Albania, and as I say, without most people noticing it, it has chalked up some important successes. So, but we have our two friends from Belgrade and Pristina at I would say a rather disturbing time at the moment in the relations between the two countries that they come from, and we're going to talk about that a bit, about the relations between Pristina and Belgrade at the moment, and also about the politics of each individual country. But then we want to have a more discursive discussion about what is going on in the Western Balkans at the moment as the sort of social reality for people who live there, because we can all follow the ins and outs of the diplomatic stuff, but there's not much that's been reported about how life has developed over the past 20 years or so in the Balkans, and both these two are very capable of helping us on that. So let me start with what happened this week. So what happened this week is that there was a meeting between Aleksandar Vučić, the president of Serbia, and Albin Kurti, the prime minister of Kosovo, in Brussels, under the watchful eye of Josep Borrell, the High Representative, and the usual high expectations and the usual zero results. So, Ilir, let me start with you. How did you feel? You know Albin very well, Albin Kurti. Were you surprised at the outcome of the failure of the talks at a time of rising tension, particularly in the north of Kosovo?
Well, I looked at it as a crisis of the process. The European Union has a mandate since 2010 to lead the normalization process between Kosovo and Serbia, and to bring both closer to itself. So it's linked with accession. And the process as such has defined EU as a facilitator. Well, I don't believe that a facilitator can do a peace process. We need a mediator. So we came to a point of a complete breakdown of trust between what Kosovo's prime minister and the EU facilitators, and I think vice versa too. And I think it should be a wake-up call for the EU member states and the US administration as well to approach the normalization process as mediators. And what does that mean? That means that you don't invite two parties to come to discuss on a text and spend a day, and that if they disagree, goodbye, we have press statements and that's it, because this has been going on for too long. It has been going on for 12 years, and it is, honestly, it has come to a point where it's frustrating also for people who are living this process. So what we need is to learn from what happened this week and hopefully have a wake-up call where the next time the leaders of Kosovo and Serbia are invited, they will know that they cannot go back home without having an agreement on what they have to discuss. You know, life is passing, and I'm looking at it like it's a whole generation later, post-Kosovo war, we still have this dysfunctional and hostile relationship, politically hostile relationship, and we need to move forward, and move forward fast.
So Vlado, looked at from Belgrade, we've had this peculiar situation of, in the past 4 or 5 months or so, there have been a slew of hostile articles in Western media about Alexander Vučić. New York Times had a major piece. Spiegel's been very critical of him, Frankfurter Allgemeine, Guardian, BBC, so on and so forth. But all of a sudden, in the EU's eyes and the United States' eyes, when it comes to these negotiations, he's no longer the problematic figure. What's been going on, do you think, in Western perceptions of Vučić? Because it seems to be quite schizophrenic at the moment.
Yeah, I guess it's some kind of a tactic going on, which has actually nothing to do with what Vučić is actually doing in Serbia and in the region. His attitude toward Kosovo has never changed, and on the contrary, there has been a radicalization of the sentiments in Serbia towards Kosovo, which has mostly been expressed through various activities of far-right groups, polluting walls and infrastructures, not only of Belgrade, but in various places in Serbia, with warmongering messages, hate messages, supposedly sentimental remembrance of the time when Kosovo was the part of Serbia, and the still ongoing fetishization of Resolution 1244, which is always taken as a crown argument.
Which, of course, was the resolution which ended the NATO intervention.
And furthermore, the resolution which is being waved around, but I don't think that anybody has ever read it. Because what nationalists in Serbia are claiming that it states, it actually doesn't. But this is the technical side of Vučić. He has various narratives which are prepared for various partners. He comes to Brussels with one agenda. He has another agenda for Serbian people and voters. Primarily, he has the third agenda when he goes to Moscow or anywhere else. So this is how he actually manages to stay afloat.
So at the moment, the prospect of an agreement emerging remains pretty remote. Would you both agree, or?
Well, we have an agreement, it's just that they can't figure it out how to implement it.
Right, so we're talking about implementation.
Yes.
Even though some have signed, some haven't signed, they play games with signatures and commitments and so on and so forth. So it's partly implementation, but it's partly also how they're interpreting the agreement. So we're in a sort of, at the moment, in a sort of cul-de-sac politically over the agreement. Meanwhile, back at home, and Vlado, I'll pick up on one or two of the things that you were saying there, about Vučić having his multiple agendas depending on where he is and who he's talking to. He has, of course, encouraged and allowed the creation of a pro-Russian atmosphere amongst part of the population in Serbia, and this has grown and taken root a bit, it seems to me. To what extent is Vučić able to control that domestic messaging that he's in great part responsible for?
He is responsible for them, but he did not initiate that, and that has a long history. This creation of this fantasy of Russia as the major protector of Serbia, or actually, if you wish, sort of like a big brother complex, it has its roots in the beginnings of the parliamentary life of Serbia in the mid-19th century. And it was basically continued throughout different ideologies, different political systems. It never really went away, so this was just a continuation of this storyline by Vučić. He's not the only perpetrator of that. I mean, the main problem of Serbia, to my eyes, is not Vučić himself, is who and in which conditions he's going to replace him, and we don't see a viable option in the political spectrum of politics.
So almost by default, he's able to stay there because there's no credible alternative, whether from his side or from...
I think he's surrounded with like-minded political figures, and basically what we have in Serbia are different political teams fighting for power, but not representing different ideologies. And particularly the question of Kosovo, the question of Russia, the question of responsibility for crimes committed on behalf of Serbia in the 1990s basically are the same, disregarding which party you're analyzing.
I mean, I think it's worth exploring just a little here about this, because in those articles that I talked about, the front and center of all those articles is that Vučić is Putin's ally in the Balkans. But this whole relationship between Serbia and Russia is actually a sort of mythological relationship in some sense, in as much that Russia has only very infrequently in the past 150 years lifted a finger on behalf of Serbia. So it's sort of in people's minds rather than actually based on any historical reality.
And they don't even have to prove that at all. I mean, they just can continue doing nothing and things will not change at all. And you can tell that by the reaction of your average Serbian guy. I mean, you know, if you ask them, and all the polls show that, who is the major economical supporter of Serbia? They would say, well, Russia and China, whereas it is the EU. But if you tell them personally, so where would you go for your economical embetterment? They would never go to Moscow or Beijing or anywhere else. Obviously, they would go to either Germany or Sweden or any European country. So clearly, they know the truth. But for some reason, there is this consensus in society in which everybody agrees that it makes sense for them to continue with this, you know, made up reality. And it has to do with the fact that the Serbian society has grown with this massive chip on their shoulder. So it all boils down to how the whole massive, extremely complicated and very tragical narrative of the 1990s has been reduced to this simplified version in which the Serbs were just growing potatoes throughout the 1990s, and then the evil NATO flew by in 1999 for no reason and just bombed the hell out of us, and then sprayed us all with this depleted uranium, so we're all dying actively of cancer in Serbia. And obviously this simplified narrative boils down to we have been bombed by the 18 countries, the United States and the EU, whereas Russia has never bombed us. So this is this simplified narrative that worked wonders. Actually.
And these are, when you talk about things like the depleted uranium, these are the kind of headlines you see on the tabloids every day, day in, day out.
The media is extremely controlled in Serbia, and basically we don't have a single decent printed media in Serbia. I mean, daily newspapers, they're all really extremely toxic tabloids, and I mean, they rely just on the headlines, basically, which are always extremely toxic. And I'll tell you a story. My wife's father, what is it, father-in-law?
Yeah, my father-in-law.
My father-in-law, and there you go. He's just a decent man, a really, really nice man. He doesn't, delve into politics, but he's just a nice individual. And then I see that his coffee table is loaded with issues of Informer, which is by far the worst of the tabloids. And they ask him, why do you keep this crap? I'm really sorry about my choice of words. Why do you even have it? And he says, well, let me tell you, it's like 40 dinars. Because all other newspapers, which are not even decent, because they aren't decent, but slightly more decent than Informer, would be like 80 or 100. So this is a clear message to you how it works. I mean, you have a very impoverished society, and then you offer this cheap product, and everybody chooses it because of the price. And then they soak up whatever they're being fed.
Exactly. Ilir, with regard to Kosovo, of course, the most neuralgic part of Kosovo is northern Kosovo. And you've got there some sort of 20 to 40,000 Serbs. I can't remember what the figure is now because it changes. And they're, in a sense, the key to the solution, but also the deterioration of the problem. How does Pristina view what their relationship with those people should be, whether they have an association of municipalities or not? Because whatever happens, you've got these very, very frightened, angry people who feel as though they're pawns not just from Pristina, but from Belgrade as well, and the European Union and the United States as well. So how do you detoxify that situation?
Thank you. This is the key question, actually. Thank you so much. And also, they have been living in a way caged, in a caged mentality, which is not good. And this is how I started my think tanking, actually, 15, 16 years ago. Post-Kosovo's declaration of independence, writing about policy options to accommodate the Kosovo Serbs, not only in the north, but throughout the new country, in a new setting. And unfortunately, we have not had a single government who has understood or internalized the importance of extending the hand to the Kosovo Serbs in the north, and to undertake a set of both confidence-building measures with them, but also to address some of their legitimate concerns. There is a limit to what Kosovo government can do in the north, but that limit should be used, that limited space, and that space hasn't been used, and it's a big... it's a failure. It's a failure for 15 years. And even now, there are unilateral measures that the entire West is condemning, that Kosovo government is doing, that's alienating even further the Serb population in northern Kosovo, instead of being the other way around. I always believed that a sign to the Serbs in the northern Kosovo would be also how Serbs who in majority live throughout the country are treated. So even with them, there is an absence of confidence building measures. And I think we have, the Serbs in the north are viewed through, with the lenses of how Belgrade is viewed and how Serbia's politics is. And there needs to be a decoupling and it hasn't happened yet. I mean, I've said this also with numerous interlocutors, both in Pristina and abroad, in my think tanking life and in my political life too. But now I work for the future. So, yeah.
Can I add something more anecdotal on that? I always think that, you know, some things are achievable and you don't have to wait for politicians to end up doing it. You can just go and be active. And we try to do that on the point of relations between Serbia and Kosovo, particularly culturally. We organized some years back this literary festival called Do You Read Me in northern, in Mitrovica. And for the first time, we actually put together Kosovar Albanian poets and prose writers, and Serbian and also regional, meaning Croatian, Bosnian, Montenegrin. And this all happened in the Albanian part of the town, in Dom Kulture, which is by the river Ibar. And I don't know if people realize Mitrovica is a deeply divided city. It's like on the northern side.
It's physically divided, isn't it?
It's physically divided. But actually the dividing line is the river Ibar, which is, I mean, it's so shallow that you can actually walk across it. And it's altogether, I think, 10 meters? And okay, on one side, there is a cafe called Riverside. I think it's on the Albanian side. And, you know, you have this jazz music and, you know, people drinking espresso. And on another side, there's a cafe Dolce Vita, and it's on the Serbian side. And again, there's like this sort of ambiental music and, you know, people just drinking their coffee and stuff. It's just surreal. It's amazing. And there is this famous bridge where there's KFOR soldiers controlling it and things like that. So being that we were really interested in attracting people from both sides of the city, both communities, we had Miki Manojlović with us, who in that time now he's kind of tainted with his relations with the current government and President Vučić, but he's an extremely well-known legendary, I mean, living legend as an actor and a really, really great actor. And he said, okay, I'll go north and I'll attract people to come. And he took like a bag of apples and he stood in this main street, like northern Mitrovica, just this one street with several back streets and nothing else. And immediately when people saw him, they knew who he was. And he was giving these apples away. And he was saying, like, come to Dom Kulture. And people were shocked because to them it meant this complete breakdown on everything that they were believing before. But actually people ended up coming. And it was this intense atmosphere that happened that evening. So eventually everybody withdrew, you know, and again there was this wall. And just another one, there is this beautiful...
When did that take place?
When?
Yeah, which year was that?
I'm always bad with the past,
right.
but I would say probably 6 to 7 years ago or something like that. Yeah. There is
You can work for the future with Ilir together.
No, but what I'm saying, I'm not putting too much trust into that, but I'm just saying that things are, you can move them. I mean, if there was more activity.
Yeah, so you mean
sides,
that it's a demonstration that there is actually, you can do things, it's just nobody tries.
Nobody's doing them. I'll tell you, I don't know if you know the name of Afrodita Silja. She's from Mitrovica. You know Afrodita. She runs Community Building Mitrovica, which is a brilliant organization. You know their project, School of Rock?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, they organized this just practice. You know, they would put together bands of children disregarding their ethnicities. So they would have like a Roma drummer and then Albanian bass player and, you know, Serbian backing vocal or whatever. And then for these kids, it just became much more important to be a bass player than an Albanian or to be a drummer than a Roma. And it worked with children great. And then what happened, where the problem happened was when they would go back home. And they would tell that to their parents, and their parents would already be contaminated with this whole identity thing. And then they would start,
unraveling the whole thing.
Just this year, Mitrovica International Jazz Day, like a few days festival, began to get out of this caged mentality that's on the both sides. And Richard Bona, whoever listens to jazz, was there as well. So I think there are, whenever there is no news, negative news coming from the city, there are events and there is interaction, but it's insufficient. That is the limits of what a small civil society can do, but their efforts, the impact of their efforts decreases once there are tensions, and there are too often tensions in the city itself.
Yeah. Vlada, I want to come back to Belgrade, a sort of slightly tangential question about Russia, and that is, we now have something between sort of 100 and 200,000 Russians in Belgrade who've come since February 2022. You also have a significant number of Ukrainian refugees in Belgrade as well. What's been and of course the Russians who've come are people who don't want to be in Russia. It's peculiar when, on the streets and with all the nationalist movements and everything, you have Z written everywhere, you have posters of Putin. And then suddenly you have these 200,000 anti-Putinists in Belgrade. How does that work?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say, but I wouldn't think that there's 200,000 anti-Putinists. There's a large chunk of this diaspora that just came for basic reasons. The country
wanted to get out.
Yeah, they either work for foreign companies or they run their own companies. I think several thousand IT companies were registered in Belgrade in the past couple of years by the Russian citizens. So it shows you that the majority of them just had sort of business reasons. There's a significant number of younger people with children. This is also noticeable in playgrounds and parks in Belgrade. And obviously, these were the people who just wanted to move away and probably have a more relaxed kind of lifestyle than it's possible to have in Russia at the moment. But there are fringes of this diaspora which have been very active in anti-war activities. And we just had this talk at lunch today. Basically, to me, this is something that I couldn't see coming, that actually Russians, well, together with Ukrainians and other foreign citizens, would be more influential in starting and continuing with anti-war activities than the Serbs were. And I was telling this little anecdote today at lunch, probably I didn't say it properly, but to me this was so telling for the ridiculousness of the general atmosphere in Serbia nowadays, this situation in which we were approached in the association Crocodile by these two Russian artists, Gleb Pushev, who is a cartoonist, and Anya Gladisheva. She's also a visual artist, and they asked us to use the outer wall of Crocodile to paint a mural dedicated to Lesya Ukrainka, in order to signify their pro-Ukrainian views. And they did this really beautiful, very feminine mural of Lesya Ukrainka. We wrote this verse in both Ukrainian and Serbian language. It had this flowery background, and she has this striking figure, really beautiful feminine figure. And this all stood in really sharp opposition to this male-dominated, aggressive, warmongering killing machine that Russia is representing, and the whole W and Z and all these angular, things that really associated, if nothing, to swastikas and things like that. And then this was destroyed several times, and stupid stuff was written over it, like, this is Serbia, there's no space for Nazism here. I mean, Lesya died in 1911. I mean, but anyways, so they were really investing a lot of time and energy and effort to reconstruct the mural. And I think it was the third time that they were actually reconstructing it when they were physically attacked by these Serbian thugs who were pro-Russian. So now we have these pro-Russian Serbs attacking pro-Ukrainian Russians in Belgrade in order to, fight off the negative influence of less Ukraine.
Strange times. Ilir, talking about strange times, it's 30 years since the European Union said it wanted to integrate the Western Balkans. You can forgive the peoples, and now, of course, Ukraine is looking to be fast-tracked in. You can forgive the people of the Western Balkans. I'm feeling a little jaundiced, and I expect the advice they would give to their friends in Kyiv would be, don't hold your breath about when you're going to get in. What has happened to?
That's exactly it.
Exactly. Yes. What has happened to people, and in particular young people who had invested so much hope in the European path? What has that done to people's expectations, and what are the actual concrete political and social consequences of this constant round of promising and then promises fizzling out for people in Bosnia, in Serbia, in Kosovo, everywhere in the region?
Wow. It is actually, ironically, the absence of promise for accession that was named policy of strategic patience in European Union. This is in 2009-10, when there was an enlargement fatigue, and the EU didn't want any new members, and they said until we fix our home, the Western Balkans should wait, and you should have this strategic patience. I hated it from the beginning, and I fought with people who had used it passionately throughout the time, because it blocked the fundamental reforms that were needed. I mean, EU accession is beautiful because of the process, because of the transformative process it has, and because you see the change in not only on the laws that you adopt and align, but also in the standard of life and the environment, the living environment too. So 10 years, there was a lid on that, and 10 years we had various attempts, as we would call them, illiberal attempts back then, when autocracy and populism started being on the rise again. And I think that various political elites were testing the space on how much state capture there can be, how much control of the freedom of speech and media there can be,
while still maintaining the path to Europe.
Yes, etc., because there was a verbal path to Europe, but there was no accession. And the last few years have been a facing of the reality where the number of legal migration has increased. I mean, Germany is taking everyone from the Western Balkans, especially in the health sector. And this is going to cause huge deformities in the societies, but we don't know what is the impact yet. But in parallel with this, it's not such a... I don't want to paint a bleak picture, because life is happening, even without European Union. There is democratic potential in every society, and every society keeps showing its own democratic potential. There is cultural life happening, and I can talk more about Kosovo in that sense because of the specific demographic where we have so much young people I mean, I was always, I was very optimistic because the large number of youth guarantees transformation. And we get done with the old ways faster. And in the Balkans, I think that's very important. So I can just say, for example, last year, there was Manifesta in Pristina, 3 months of phenomenal artistic activities. I mean, revitalization of public space for culture. We have now Center for Narrative Practice, which is inherited or is the legacy of Manifesta. We have a DocuFest, which you know, it's an institution of documentary films in Prizren.
Olip Literary Festival, which is
yes.
very important.
And then Manifest and Anibar, which is an animation in a different city. We have Wine Fest. Pristina is booming with cultural activities, especially post-COVID. I think people, because the shutdown was so rigorous, everybody started appreciating freedom far more and started occupying the space which there is in a society to exercise that freedom. And I mean, I can tell you the last few years, if every single day there are different, or night, there are a few concerts, festivals. I mean, ICT sector is booming in Serbia too, but in Kosovo as well, like booming, unbelievable. So we have a new generation that has good salaries, that has a different demand of what kind of institutions they want, parallelly with people who are leaving mostly for Germany. And I think in the region, it's more or less the same. You have the internal dynamics, and then you have the migration. We will see how much this migration is going to disturb the entire political socioeconomic order. But what I have seen in the last few years is that the governments started panicking as well. So they're looking into ways how to support, how to provide an institutional support to the industries that maintain people. And also the 6 governments, in order to retain the brain, they have understood that they cannot do it per se in their own countries, but there is an attempt to do it within the Western Balkans. Which is this plan in 2020, which is called Common Regional Market, and that means enacting 4 freedoms, EU 4 freedoms in the Western Balkans, in order to come to 6, 7, 8% economic growth and maintain people there. So there are attempts. It's not all bleak. 10 years ago, it was far bleaker in terms of these things that they are today. So I think life has a way of its own way.
Ilir, that's very encouraging, and it's certainly striking throughout the region, the concentration of startups and people working in new technologies, whether it's Belgrade, whether it's Pristina. There is a lot of activity in that sector, and of course that sector is often detached from the sort of political nonsense that's going on. They just go on and do their things. And there are some very successful companies emerging in this region, which is encouraging. I think I'll turn it over to the audience now. If you have any questions about anything that had been raised or that you may yourself want to raise. Hannah.
Thanks a lot, Ardis. I have a question about the difference between the... Sorry. I have the question about the 3 communities, if I can map them like this, of Serbians in Kosovo. Because I remember my first trip to Kosovo in 2010, and what really struck me at that time, that people in Gračanica looked much more pro-Serbian and tough in terms of the anti-Kosovo, let's say, position than even people in Mitrovica, and we traveled to the northern Mitrovica, so we crossed the border and we saw everything over there. And the most proactive people who were ready to be engaged in the not only dialogue but in the political life, they were those groups, communities from the southern Kosovo. So do we see the changes in these dynamics between the three groups, and why such a striking difference we still after so many years can observe between south and north?
Thank you for your question. I never looked at it as three, only as two. The ones from north of the Ibar River and the other ones south of the Ibar River. Regardless of what they were saying back then, they are the most integrated institutionally. And right now, today, I haven't done a field trip in a few years, so I will not know what the correct answer is. And I don't even, honestly, I think that regardless of the attitudes they have, they need an extended hand. There is nobody to extend the hand towards them. And for me, that is the bigger issue than the attitudes towards cooperation.
Jan, and then Christoph.
Maybe it's a follow-up.
Yes, I provoked you.
Jan had his hand up first.
Well, Jan Farfaljež Gedrovic, visiting fellow. Thank you for this interesting conversation. I actually waited eagerly, given the fact that we have speakers coming from the Balkans, until I hear the eternal phrase, "Let me tell you a story," and it only took 15 minutes, so I'm very satisfied. But one comment and one question. So the comment would be about this EU transformative power. Actually, I think it was a concept developed by Heather Grubb, who used to be one of the former Europe's Futures Fellow, but perhaps we should be a bit more careful with this belief of the transformative power. You have other instances of scholars like Martin Mendelski saying that actually EU has a pathological power because of this, accession limbo for state captures, etc., etc. But I would like to relate to some aspects mentioned by Vlad about this differing perception of Serbs when it comes to some aspects in political developments. So obviously one of the most important of those aspects would be the normalization of relations with Kosovo. And there was not a single Serbian government that actually survived the Kosovo question with any single developments leading to momentous changes. And this brings me to this paradox about the democratic will, because from a democratic standpoint, there is not a single chance that the recognition of the Kosovo state will happen. But at the same time, you have this, autocrat leader who's having a big control of the media, who has a big state capture. And is he actually one of the only available politicians being able to push forward with this normalization of relations with Kosovo, despite the popular will, by using undemocratic means?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that was the main point for actually bringing Vučić to the top of Serbian political life. I think the feeling was that, I don't know if this translates to English, probably not, he has a lot of butter on his head.
No, that's a very Serbian phrase.
But you know what I mean. I mean, or let me rephrase it, he has a lot of blood on his hands. He was deeply involved in atrocities and massacres and everything that was going on throughout the 1990s in Bosnia. It's a wonder that he did not end up in The Hague, first of all. But then he was seen as the guarantee of Serbian future. He played that well. This was the beginning of his multiple narratives. And that was directed to the EU, particularly to Germany and Angela Merkel. And I think he kind of faced them all with the story that he's going to guarantee all these things that nobody else could, because the previous echelon of the politicians, which were mainly the Democratic Party, that came to power after the assassination of Prime Minister Djindjic, and they were just scared shitless of all these questions. They couldn't deal with them. But somehow, I think Vučić had a lot of, well, he thought that he had a lot of credit with Serbian voters, that he could slowly crumble and do these things in order to appease the EU politicians, which he saw as instrumental for him staying at power. And it's no wonder why Florian Bieber, at the end of the day, coined the term stabilocracy based on what actually Vučić was doing all the while. I don't think that he ever intended to really do what he was promising to do. But this was just this multiple game that he kept playing all along. So now, what is the final result? Because he really cracked down on the actual opposition. When he came to power, he created these monsters, these demons that had actually nothing to do with the actual politicians. I'm actually looking at you because you would know how he used this term, žuti, right? Žuti. Žuti means the yellow. And that would probably signify, again, the Democratic Party being his arch enemy at that time. But then it just floated away from any conceivable, any realistic thing. It just became this monster that he's fighting all the time, the yellow, or the Gilosovci, or anything that he was using in the past. And then he created this political scene in which he's just surrounded with like-minded politicians. So now there is no solution, and this is seriously my honest belief that actually Serbia cannot produce political will to change this paradigm. It just stays as it is, and I'm really impressed with your optimistic view of our current reality. This probably has to do with the fact that you're living it elsewhere and I'm actually in Serbia. But I mean, looking at it from the position of Serbia...
To be fair, he's in Sarajevo, which is not exactly...
Not that far away.
I think Sarajevo...
But I think that people... I understand where you're coming from, but sometimes focusing on what we want, we miss seeing the democratic potential that it shows. You know, and it has been showing for years everywhere in the Western Balkans 6. And yes, maybe none of what we really want is not happening today, but there is quite a lot of proof to show that the society has a potential to fight for what it believes in, which is not Kosovo, Serbia, and it's everything but Kosovo, Serbia, both, or the relations of others in the Western Balkans. And I think this is beautiful, and when we see this, that should be a tap of energy to restore the faith that, and we're prone to lose faith and be fatalistic as a region, you know.
Yeah. And there was an interesting thing. I was speaking to a friend from Belgrade who has made quite a lot of friends amongst the Russian community, and he said to me, the really interesting thing about the Russian community in Belgrade is it has the highest concentration of LGBTQ Russians anywhere outside of Russia. So, i.e., they haven't gone to Georgia, they haven't gone to Armenia, they obviously haven't gone to the Emirates. And one of the reasons for that is because actually for all of the Z and all in the pro-Putin, Belgrade is a pretty liberal, tolerant, easy place to live, where I suspect Tbilisi and even Yerevan are probably more difficult to negotiate. So there's a reality about Belgrade. Lots of ordinary people who know that this whole thing is a complete farce. And there is potential there as well, I think, even though, I mean, we saw the marches against violence. A lot of people did initially turn up, and although they're not able to turn that into any meaningful political movement, they nonetheless did go out on the streets and express their
It was a
dissatisfaction.
show of strength, and it was good to see. And there was something healing about it, to see just really ordinary people marching for the things that you have no problem, relating to. Also, recent Pride Day, and what you said, I mean, I think it multiplied in terms of a number of people who participated, and everyone was saying, well, you just heard Russian. I mean, so there were all these Russians. So this one saying, I mean, they kind of weirdly contributed to some processes in the society which for years on end have been traumatic. Belgrade could appear relaxed and tolerant, but it could also appear very easily very aggressive and very, very neurotic. And the Pride Day particularly was the platform for right-wing thugs, hooligans to clash with the police, because there was always a massive cordons protecting the LGBTQ people. So it always would turn very violent. This year somehow it did not. I mean, so it's really interesting to see. Plus this again, this engagement of Russians in this thing.
Christoph, sorry.
I've just been to Gračanica and to Mitrovica last week, so I thought I could maybe chip in a little bit on the question. No? But when you go to Gračanica these days, I think you very clearly see, I don't know when your trip actually was, no? But you see that over these last 10 years you had actually a quite solid process of integration to quite a far extent, so everyone pays with euros, everyone virtually has a Kosovo-issued identity card, everyone uses Kosovo license plates, virtually everyone has a bank account in the Kosovo system using euros. They might have a second one for dinars, but still. And when you compare this to the north, I think there also, I mean, after 2013, there was quite a process of integration, in particular into police and judicial structures. But it never went that far. There was always a Serbian parallel municipality, which did not exist in Gračanica, in all the 4 municipalities in the north. And now, since the last 1.5 years, and in particular since November, when the Serbs kind of went out of the Kosovo institutions in the north, the situation is actually really, it's a very different planet and functions very differently from Gračanica. I never got a bill in euros, while in Gračanica you only get bills in euro practically. And even so, kind of there was this outflow of the Kosovo institutions, life functions more or less normally. So you also see that there was still quite a lot there actually of this Serbian institutions functioning. It's not to say that there are no problems related to this, but more or less, there was definitely not a collapse of public services. And I think people in the north are also much more angry than people in Gračanica. I think people, the kind of the deployment of the special police in the north is something which comes immediately, and regardless with whomever you talk, a radical nationalist or some moderate, open-minded people working with NGOs, this comes always as the first issue, and people are really pissed about this. There are several of these bases and checkpoints, so when you move from out of Mitrovica towards the north, towards Leposavić, between Zvečan, and there's one of these big checkpoints where virtually everyone has to pass by if you go to the north or the south of the north. And I mean, I went there just to see, because people are so worked up about it. And I mean, for me, not being Serb, it's a heavily armed checkpoint. 4 guys in really kind of this heavy police, long barrel guns and concrete walls and stuff, and others, normal policemen who then check your documents. But if you drive through, you can feel that this is kind of something for Kosovo Serbs, that they really feel uncomfortable. So, and I think in Gračanica, it's more that people, it's essentially on the main road from Gnila and Egilan to Pristina. So, Kosovo's driving through is completely normal, and many people I know, they actually fill up their car with at the petrol station in the next village, which is Albanian, because they think that petrol is actually better there than in Gračanica. So, you know, this is something which is...
And then they go to the shopping malls and they hang out and people go out. Yes, 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 there is more interaction with Pristina, with the city itself, yes.
Maybe also a little bit of more understanding. I mean, I think one of the big problems in Kosovo is that I think the understanding of the problems and the views of the respective other side is actually pretty low on both sides. But I think in Gračanica maybe it's a bit low, it's a bit higher than in the north towards Pristina. And maybe last thing, I think what people in Gračanica are, and it has been rather peaceful when the incidents were happening in the north, but what people are worried is that if something ugly happens in the north,
then obviously,
you know, what will happen to us? You know, just need a crazy guy shooting at two policemen and a reaction from the Albanian side, and then, you know, for whom is this more relevant? For the people in the south or for the people somewhere in the north in Leposavić? So I think that was kind of what people in Gračanica and the south were really concerned about.
Thank you, Christoph. That was very helpful. Anyone else with any questions? Yes, Miha.
Well, I have two questions, one for the both speakers and one for Ilir. So, first, for the both. Now it's over 20 years as the major military conflicts finished. Can you say what is the big picture in the lands once being part of the Yugoslav Federation? What are these states? What are these regimes? Is democracy prevailing? What kind of democracy, if it is? Is nation state strong there? Well, in these terms, so for the both of you. And one for Ilir. In May this year, in Ideology and Politics Journal, we published an article, very rich empirical analysis of party system in Kosovo, with very good analysis, and you definitely see that this system has a variety of ideologies and parties, so you have rich ideological menu. However,
you test the ideology.
Well,
yes.
However, these parties are one ethnicity only. Do you? So they are ideologically diverse, but they refer one ethnic group. So do you see there's any potential in Kosovo to create a party that would include citizens from all sides?
Thank you.
Would you maybe reply to this question
after
first?
you? Because I need to think about the answer.
It's a very good question, but it implies a very long reply, and I don't see how we can really put it together. Obviously, Yugoslavia disintegrated, and all these new states were formed with different dynamics, and so there are all these realities. On the surface level, all are democracies. But, you know, to compare Slovenia with Macedonia, you know, or Serbia, it will be very hard. I mean, but these were always the dynamics of Yugoslavia, I would say. Even in the most integrated times, there was a clear difference culturally, infrastructurally, whatever, between different states. And I remember as we would travel, like, you know, with parents, and there would be this bumpy road in Serbia, and then as you would, there were no clear borders, but you would know when you would reach Croatia, and the road would become slightly better. But then after a while it would become really smooth, and that was the point where you're reaching Slovenia. And these things stayed. They were like that before, and they are like that now. They reflect to the social life, they reflect to the political life, they reflect to the question of individual freedoms and whatnot. So there are all these different experiences really at stake. And I think this is at the end of the day what at least potentially made Yugoslavia an exciting project, a terribly failed project, but you know, with a lot of potential. And I'm sorry that we didn't know how to handle it, basically, because there were all these differences put together, and you just couldn't live through. So now, basically, everybody was craving these identities, and this is what we are left with, and nobody seems to be satisfied. And this is the main point of misunderstanding between us and people from, former Eastern Bloc, where we still hold these nostalgic sort of views on how life in Yugoslavia was. It's, again, a massive simplification. It has nothing to do with the actual reality of how life really was in Yugoslavia. But people remember stable wages. They remember the fact that they could afford to go and spend 15 days or their summer holidays in one Croatian or Montenegrin resort or another and things like that. And they remember the fact that, at least for a little while, and I think this really numbers in years, but it was significant, and I think I was pretty lucky to be born in the midst of it, because I was born in 1965, and this really refers to these generations that were actually brought up in the middle of this socialist experiment of Yugoslavia, where this identity felt believable. It did not feel as a construction. We did believe in Yugoslavianism, and this is what we wanted to destroy. We did destroy it, and then we went one step back, or lower, so to say, to these more immediate and in the same time more oppressive identities, which are these ethnic/national identities that now we can't, go out of at all, at least. To have a Yugoslav identity, to my mind, was something that you could take off and put on, by will, whereas these things which are connected to these awful concepts of blood and soil and history and whatnot, they just stick to you. And you just have to carry them around. But people still seem infatuated with these. And they're into national flags, they're into anthems, they're into creating and recreating and continuing the different national myths. And this is, I think, what we live in. So this is the situation, at least in the Western Balkans part of former Yugoslavia. Whereas now, if you travel from Serbia to Croatia, and somehow I think at least the Serbs always liked to compare, even if they gave themselves sort of like a negative mark in that, but they would say, well, we are 5 years behind of Croatia. But now it's not even comparable anymore. Seriously isn't. I mean, Croatia is in the EU, it's in Schengen. I mean, whereas Serbia is sinking backwards continuously in its own created reality, which is, if nothing, extremely dark. So, yeah, this is it.
Yeah, I would echo Vlad's comments that it's the question begs such a long answer. I mean, one of the things that it's worth remembering is that the successor states all emerged in different ways at different times with different constitutions and different approaches to democracy, to identities, and so on and so forth. So it's actually rather difficult to compare the states that emerged out of Yugoslavia, because they, along with that structural difference that existed in Yugoslavia, you now have very different constitutional identities from state to state. Ilir, I
will not go. I mean, it is definitely it's a great question with hours of discussion. But just to come back to national identity, I think that national identity is not the problem. I think it's not even a problem. It's equality, but not equality as an abstract notion. Equality as true equality, and living, treating the other in an equal way is what's important in the entire region. And in terms of, and this is where I would stop because it's long, and in terms of multi-ethnic parties in Kosovo, it's not that it hasn't been tried. But the electoral system and the political system is designed as such not to allow a multi-ethnic party, because the parliamentary seats are divided along parties from different ethnicities, and then institutions are designed as such as well, and percentage in civil service and public service, etc. So the system doesn't allow you to have a multi-ethnic party, because you would get nothing out of it, neither a fair representation in the parliament, nor be able to be a multi-ethnic party participant in a government where the constitution said you need one Serb from minority communities, one from other non-Serb minority communities, and the parliament seats are allocated as such. But we can discuss about it tomorrow, maybe, since we have, yeah.
Okay, well, look, thank you both very much, Ilir and Vlada. Thank you for coming, everyone. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. I hope you have too. And don't forget that tomorrow we have Eva and Katie, who are going to be talking about, I imagine, all sorts of diverse things. Eva will be talking about democracy, I dare say. Katie will, I hope, be talking about Northern Ireland, because I've seen her sitting there during this discussion, and I'm going to be fascinated to see how many echoes there are when Katie speaks tomorrow about the subjects that we've been discussing today. So please join me in thanking our two guests.